The baseball sliced through the air like a comet, and Steven Seagal gripped the bat with calloused hands that had scrubbed toilets just hours before. 50,000 voices roared in his ears. The championship hung on this single swing. But how did a janitor who cleaned vomit from concrete at midnight found himself at home plate with the championship on the line? Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Steven Seagal had perfected the art of being invisible. For 3 years, he had pushed his cleaning cart through the concrete corridors of Riverside Stadium, arriving at midnight when the crowds had long dispersed. He scrubbed gum from bleacher seats. He mopped beer-stained floors. He emptied trash bins overflowing with hot dog wrappers and crumpled programs. His uniform hung loose on his frame, his shoulders curved inward from years of bending over buckets and brooms. The day shift workers barely noticed him. The night security guards nodded, but never asked his name. He preferred it that way. Invisibility was armor. Steven had one reason for enduring the overnight shifts, and the minimum wage. Lainey, his daughter, was 9 years old, with her mother's dark curls and his own stubborn chin. Leukemia had taken Camilla 3 years ago, leaving Steven with hospital debts that towered like skyscrapers and a little girl who needed him whole. He worked the stadium job because the hours let him see Lainey off to school each morning. He would make her breakfast, usually scrambled eggs and toast, then walk her to the bus stop. She would squeeze his hand 3 times. Their secret code. I love you. He would squeeze back 4 times. I love you more. Then she would climb onto the yellow bus, and he would return home to sleep until his alarm shrieked at 10 in the evening. The cycle repeated, day after day, week after week, month after month. But there were moments when the armor cracked. Maria Lewis stood in section 214 with her arms crossed, her tailored navy suit sharp enough to cut glass. She was 38 years old and had spent the last decade climbing through the ranks of professional baseball management. 6 months ago, she had become the first female CEO of the Riverside Hawks. The press had celebrated her achievement. The old guard had waited for her to fail. She would not fail. Maria had arrived at the stadium at 6 in the morning to inspect every detail before the championship series began. The Hawks were down 3-2 against the Bay City Titans. Tonight's game would determine whether the season ended in glory or humiliation. She had walked through the luxury suites, tested the sound system, reviewed the security protocols. Now she stood in the upper deck, where the cheap seats attracted families who saved all year for a single game. A streak of grime marked the concrete step. Her jaw tightened. She pulled out her phone and called facility management. 15 minutes later, Steven emerged from the service elevator, pushing his cart. He moved slowly, quietly, as if apologizing for existing. Maria watched him approach. His uniform was faded, but clean. His work boots had been resoled multiple times. He looked older than he probably was. She gestured at the stain with sharp precision. This section should have been cleaned hours ago. We have paying customers coming tonight. People who expect better than this. Do you understand what's at stake? This is the championship. Everything we've worked for comes down to tonight, and I'm finding dirt in the stands. Steven knelt down without speaking. He sprayed cleaner on the concrete and began scrubbing with a brush. The chemical smell rose sharp and bitter. Maria stood over him, her heel tapping against the ground. What's your name? Steven Seagal, ma'am. Well, Steven Seagal, I expect perfection. If I find one more problem, one more anything out of place, you're done here. Understood? Yes, ma'am. She walked away, her footsteps echoing down the concrete steps. Steven continued scrubbing. His hands moved in steady circles, erasing the stain. When the spot gleamed clean, he sat back on his heels and allowed himself one deep breath. He thought of Lainey's medical bills. He thought of the envelope on his kitchen counter, marked past due. He thought of the way she had smiled that morning when he had made her favorite breakfast. Then he stood up, packed his supplies, and moved on to the next section. But something had shifted in the stadium's air that morning, though neither Stephen nor Maria could have known it then. Maria's office overlooked the field from behind home plate. The view was spectacular. The grass stretched out in perfect geometric patterns. The scoreboard glowed even in daylight, cycling through advertisements and team statistics. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt the invisible weight of 1,000 doubting eyes. Her father had built Lewis Industries from nothing. Import-export, manufacturing, real estate. He had conquered every market he entered. When Maria had told him she wanted to run a baseball team, he had laughed. Not cruelly, just dismissively. "Baseball is a man's world, Maria. You'll embarrass yourself." She had bought the Hawks with her own money. Money she had earned running the Pacific division of Lewis Industries. Money her father claimed she had only earned because of his name. 5 years of watching from the owner's box. 5 years of learning every detail of the operation. Then the previous CEO had suffered a heart attack, and the board, reluctantly, had turned to her. 6 months later, she was one game away from either validation or vindication of her father's words. Her assistant knocked and entered. Thomas was 26, efficient, and terrified of her. He stood in the doorway with his tablet clutched against his chest, his face pale. "There's a situation with Jake Deakins." Maria's stomach dropped. Jake Deakins was the Hawks' star player, the clutch hitter, the one everyone expected to carry the team to victory. "What situation?" "He slipped in the shower this morning, twisted his ankle pretty badly. The doctors are examining him now." Thomas did not need to finish the sentence. Maria could read the rest in his expression. It did not look good. Maria stared out at the empty stadium. 50,000 seats would fill in 9 hours. Television cameras would broadcast to millions. Sponsors had paid enormous sums for advertising time. The city had planned a victory parade. Everything depended on Jake Deakins' ankle. She reached for her phone and dialed her father's number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Of course, he was probably in a meeting, surrounded by men who took him seriously. Men who would never question his right to sit at the head of the table. Maria hung up without leaving a message, but she did not know that far below her office, in the dim corridors where pipes dripped and fluorescent lights flickered, Stephen Siegel was discovering something that would change everything. Stephen had learned the stadium's hidden geography over 3 years of night shifts. He knew which service elevator made a grinding noise. He knew which bathroom stall door hung crooked on its hinges. He knew where the security cameras had blind spots and where the air conditioning vents rattled during humid nights. But he had never been in the equipment room beneath the home team dugout. The door had always been locked. Tonight, as he passed by pushing his cart toward the locker rooms, he noticed it standing open. Light spilled into the corridor. Voices echoed from inside. Stephen paused. He should keep walking. He should ignore the open door and the careless voices. He had work to do. 16 bathrooms, 8 locker rooms, 12 concession areas. The list marched through his head in the same order every night. But something pulled him forward. He stepped into the doorway. 2 equipment managers were sorting through gear, tossing items into bags with little care for organization. They stopped when they saw him. The older one waved him off with irritation. Stephen nodded and turned to leave, but as he did, his eye caught something leaning against the far wall. A bat. Old. Worn. The wood darkened with age and use. The equipment managers followed his gaze. The younger one laughed and mentioned that it might have belonged to Tommy Lewis, the owner's father who had played in the minor leagues decades ago before making his fortune. Never made it to the majors, though. Got injured his rookie season. They left, flipping off the light as they went. Stephen stood in the darkness for a moment. Then he flipped the light back on and walked to the bat. The wood was smooth under his fingers. Someone had taken great care of it once. The grain ran straight and true. Near the handle, barely visible, initials had been carved into the wood. T.C. Stephen picked up the bat. It felt right in his hands, balanced, alive. He should put it down. He should leave. He should return to his cart and his checklist and his invisible life. Instead, he took a practice swing. The movement came naturally, muscle memory rising from somewhere deep. His shoulders unwound, his hips rotated. The bat sang through the air. For just a moment, Steven Seagal was 22 years old again, standing in the batter's box at State University, the crowd chanting his name. For just a moment, he was the player scouts had called a sure thing, the athlete who had turned down minor league contracts to stay close to Camilla during her difficult pregnancy. Then Laney had been born 2 months early. The medical bills had started immediately. Baseball had become a luxury he could not afford. He set the bat down carefully and turned off the light. But he did not notice the figure standing in the shadows of the corridor, watching him with calculating eyes. Jake Deacon sat on the training table with his ankle elevated and wrapped in ice. The team doctor shook his head slowly and delivered the verdict. Jake was done. The sprain was too severe. If he put weight on it, he could tear the ligament completely. That would end not just the game, but possibly his career. Coach Roger stood with his arms crossed, his face gray. He was 62 years old and had coached for 4 decades. This was his best chance at a championship, possibly his last chance. The doctor began packing his equipment and left to prepare the official medical report. After he departed, Coach Roger sat down heavily. The training room smelled like disinfectant and defeat. They sat in silence for a long minute. Then Jake spoke. "What about Steven?" Coach Roger looked up sharply. "Who?" "The night janitor, Steven Seagal. I've seen him taking practice swings in the corridor. The guy has a beautiful swing, natural, like he played seriously once. Are you delirious from the pain medication? I'm serious. Watch him sometime. He moves like a ball player. He's a janitor. So? Maybe he used to be something else." Coach Roger stared at his injured player. The kid was grasping at straws. They both knew it. But drowning men grab at anything. The coach stood and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back at Jake. Then he pulled out his phone and began making calls. And up in her office, Maria Lewis was about to receive news that would force her to make an impossible decision. Maria's computer screen glowed in the darkened office. Outside, the stadium had begun to fill. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. In 2 hours, the first pitch would fly. Coach Roger sat across from her desk, looking older than he had that morning. He explained what Jake had noticed, what he had discovered. Steven Seagal had played college ball at State University 15 years ago. He was good, really good. Scouts were watching him. He was projected to go in the early rounds of the draft. Then life happened. His girlfriend got pregnant. The baby came early with complications. He dropped out to work and take care of his family. Never got drafted. Never played professionally. The trail went cold after that. Maria leaned back in her chair. The coach continued. According to Jake, Steven could still hit. With Jake out, they needed a miracle. This might be it. Maria stood up and walked to the window. Below, she could see the grounds crew preparing the field. Everything looked perfect. The bases were secured. The pitcher's mound was precisely regulation height. The outfield grass had been cut to exactly 3 inches. The coach explained the emergency player provision, the league rules, the medical screening requirements, the one-time eligibility. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. Maria closed her eyes. She thought of her father's dismissive laugh. She thought of the board members who had voted against her appointment. She thought of every man who had ever looked at her and seen nothing but Tommy Lewis's daughter. "Bring him to me," she said. Steven was in section 340, scrubbing dried soda from a seat, when the security guard found him. They rode the elevator down in silence. Stephen's mind raced through possibilities. He was being fired. Someone had complained. He had done something wrong. Laney's medical bills flashed through his thoughts. He could not lose this job. The security guard led him through corridors Stephen had never seen before. They were carpeted. The walls were painted soft gray instead of industrial beige. They stopped at a door marked CEO. The office was enormous. Maria Lewis stood by the window. Coach Roger sat in a chair to her left. Thomas stood by the door with his tablet. Maria spoke quickly, her words precise as scalpels. She knew about his college baseball career. She knew about the draft projections. She asked why he had never pursued a professional career. Stephen explained. His daughter. The early birth. The complications. The medical bills. His wife's death 3 years ago. Maria's expression flickered. Something that might have been sympathy, but it vanished quickly. "Can you still hit a baseball?" Coach Roger leaned forward and laid out the situation. Their star player was injured. They needed someone to fill in for tonight's game. Someone who could hit. Jake Deakins believed Stephen could do it. The terms were clear. $10,000 guaranteed. Medical screening required. Emergency contract. And if they won, a championship bonus. $50,000. $50,000. Stephen thought of Laney. He thought of the past due bills. He thought of the roof that leaked when it rained, and the car that needed new brakes, and the countless small emergencies that eroded his paycheck to nothing. Stephen looked down at his hands. They were rough from chemicals and scrubbing. The knuckles were scarred. These were not the hands of a baseball player anymore, but they were the hands of a father. "I'll do it," he said. What he did not know, what no one in that room could have guessed, was that the old wooden bat in the equipment room had once belonged to Maria's father, Tommy Lewis, the man who had abandoned his baseball dreams, the man who had never forgiven himself for choosing money over the game he loved. And that same bat was about to change everything. The press box exploded with noise when the lineup was announced. Steven Siegel, jersey number 42, pinch hitting for Jake Deakins. The reporters scrambled for information. Who was Steven Siegel? Where had he come from? This had to be a mistake. Maria sat in the owner's box and ignored the buzzing of her phone. Reporters wanted comments. Board members wanted explanations. Her father had finally called back, but she had sent it to voicemail. On the field, Stephen stood in the dugout wearing a uniform that was slightly too big. The other players had been professional. They had shaken his hand. They had welcomed him. But he could see the doubt in their eyes. The first 6 innings were brutal. The Titans led 4-1. The Hawks' pitching was strong, but their hitting was cold. Stephen sat on the bench and watched, his stomach churning with nerves. In the 7th inning, with 2 outs and nobody on base, Coach Roger called his name. The walk to the batter's box felt like a mile. The stadium noise was a physical force. Stephen picked up a bat from the rack, the standard aluminum everyone used. It felt wrong in his hands, too light, too hollow. He stepped back into the dugout and walked to the equipment room. The door was unlocked. He found the old wooden bat still leaning against the wall where he had left it. He carried it to the plate. The crowd noticed. Murmurs rippled through the stands. A wooden bat? In the championship? Who was this guy? The Titans' pitcher smirked. He wound up and threw a fastball, 96 miles per hour, right down the middle. Stephen swung and missed. The crowd groaned. The pitcher grinned and threw again. Another fastball, high and tight. Strike 2. Maria closed her eyes in the owner's box. This was the end of her career. This was the story that would follow her forever. The woman who put a janitor in the championship game. The pitcher wound up for the 3rd time. But something happened in that moment. Stephen felt the wood warm in his hands. He remembered being 22 and fearless. He remembered Camilla in the stands. Pregnant and glowing, cheering for him. He remembered every time Laney had squeezed his hand 3 times. The pitch came. Stephen swung. The crack of wood on ball was a sound unlike any other. The crowd held its breath as the ball rocketed toward right field. It climbed and climbed, defying gravity, defying doubt, defying every reasonable expectation. It cleared the fence by 15 feet. Home run. The stadium exploded. 50,000 people on their feet, screaming themselves hoarse. Stephen rounded the bases in a daze. His teammates mobbed him at home plate. Coach Roger was crying. Thomas was screaming into his tablet, trying to update the team's social media accounts with trembling fingers. In the owner's box, Maria Lewis stood with tears streaming down her face. But the game was not over. The Hawks were still down 4-2. They needed 3 more runs, and Stephen would bat again in the 9th inning with the game on the line. Bottom of the 9th, 2 outs. The Hawks had clawed back to tie the game 4-4. The tying run was on second base. The winning run stood in the on-deck circle. Stephen, he walked to the plate for the 2nd time that night. The wooden bat felt like an extension of his arms now. He could feel the grain. He could feel the history soaked into the wood. The Titans' closer was their best pitcher. He had not allowed a run in his last 15 appearances. He stared down at Stephen with cold confidence. The first pitch was a curveball that broke sharply. Stephen laid off. Ball 1. The second pitch was a changeup. Stephen started to swing but held back. Ball 2. The crowd was roaring. The noise was deafening. Stephen stepped out of the box and looked up into the stands. He could not see individual faces, just a blur of movement and color. But somewhere in that blur was Laney, watching on television in their small apartment, gripping her stuffed bear the way she did when she was nervous. Stephen stepped back into the box. The pitcher wound up and released a fastball, 98 miles per hour, inside corner. Impossible to hit cleanly. Stephen swung. The ball jumped off the bat like it had been launched from a cannon. It screamed over the shortstop's head, over the left fielder's desperate leap, over the fence, over the seats, over the stadium lights, into the warm night sky. Home run. Game over. Hawks win the championship. The stadium became chaos. Fans rushed the field. The Hawks players lifted Stephen onto their shoulders. Fireworks exploded above the scoreboard. Somewhere in the press box, reporters scrambled to rewrite their stories, to capture the impossible moment they had just witnessed. Maria Lewis stood in the owner's box, her hands pressed against the glass, watching the celebration below. Her phone buzzed. Her father. She answered. His voice came through thick and unsteady, carrying emotions she had never heard from him before. Maria, I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. She could hear something in his voice she had never heard before. Pride, respect, maybe even love. I know, she said softly. On the field, Stephen Siegel, janitor, single father, forgotten dreamer, stood at home plate holding the wooden bat. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward his face, but he barely noticed. He was thinking of Laney. He was thinking of Camilla. He was thinking of how life sometimes gives you a second chance when you least expect it. The press conference was packed. Maria stood at the podium with Stephen beside her. Reporters shouted questions. Stephen answered simply. His father had taught him to hit when he was 6. They used to play in the park every Sunday. Maria spoke about trust, about giving people chances even when it seemed impossible, about how Stephen had earned this moment 15 years ago when he made the hardest choice a person can make, putting his family first. The reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Camera shutters clicked. Later, after the crowds had dispersed and the stadium had finally emptied, Stephen found Maria standing in section 214, the same section where she had yelled at him that morning. I want to apologize for what I said earlier, for how I treated you. You were under pressure, I understand. That's not an excuse. They stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the empty field. Maria explained that the bat he had used belonged to her father. Tommy Lewis had played minor league ball 40 years ago, got injured his first season, never made it to the majors. She thought he had carried that disappointment his whole life. After tonight's game, she had called him. They talked for an hour, longest conversation they had had in years. Maria turned to face Stephen directly. She offered him a job, not as a player. The emergency eligibility was one time only, but as a hitting coach, someone who understood what it meant to fight for something, someone who could teach young players that talent meant nothing without heart. Stephen thought of Laney, thought of the championship bonus in his bank account, thought of how coaching would mean day shifts, regular hours, a chance to be present for his daughter's life. "Yes, I accept." They shook hands. Two people who had started the day looking down at each other and ended it looking forward together. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, Stephen stood in the same park where his father had taught him to hit. Laney stood in the batter's box, the wooden bat, Tommy Lewis's bat, gripped in her small hands. He tossed the ball underhand. Laney swung hard, connecting solidly. The ball flew across the grass. "Did you see that, Dad? Did you see?" "I saw, sweetheart. That was perfect." She ran to retrieve the ball, her laughter bright in the warm air. Stephen stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her. The sun was shining. The grass was green. Life stretched out ahead of them, full of possibility. Sometimes the game gives you a second chance. Sometimes you get to step up to the plate one more time. Sometimes you hit a home run that saves more than just a championship. Sometimes you save yourself. And that, Stephen Siegel understood now, was the greatest victory of all. If this story touched something in you, hit that like button and share it with someone you want to hear with. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story.